Hercule Poirot sat on the pristine white sand of Rhodes, the golden Mediterranean sun glinting off the sparkling blue water before him. Dressed immaculately in crisp white flannels and shaded by a large Panama hat, Poirot was the very picture of meticulous care. Despite the serene setting, Poirot's sharp mind remained alert, ever the observer of human nature. Beside him, Pamela Lyle lounged comfortably, her animated chatter filling the air. Dressed in the barest essentials that modern fashion allowed, she embodied youthful exuberance. Occasionally she paused to apply more sun oil, her hands working quickly to maintain her carefully cultivated bronze glow. On her other side, Sarah Blake lay face down on a brightly striped towel, her perfectly tanned skin gleaming in the sun. Pamela glanced at her friend enviously. "I am still so patchy," Pamela murmured, her tone regretful. She turned to Poirot with a request. "Would you mind? Just below the right shoulder blade. I can't reach properly." Poirot obliged, wiping his hand discreetly on his handkerchief afterward. Pamela resumed her stream of conversation. "I was right about that woman in the Chanel model," she declared. "Valentine Chantry. She's marvelous, isn't she? Just the way she carries herself. I can see why people go crazy over her." Miss Lyle's fascination with human behavior was unrelenting. Her sharp eyes had already catalogued the other guests at the hotel, including the glamorous Valentine Chantry and her brooding husband, Commander Tony Chantry. The Chantrys had arrived only days ago, yet they had already captured everyone's attention. Valentine with her dazzling beauty, and Tony with his intimidating silence. Valentine's allure, however, seemed to have caught the eye of more than her husband. Douglas Gold, a strikingly handsome young man with theatrical good looks, was not subtle in his admiration. His wife, Marjorie Gold, a small, mousy woman with a diffident air, seemed almost invisible in comparison. Pamela couldn't help but pity her. "She's so overshadowed," Pamela whispered, watching as Marjorie hesitated near the water's edge. "And he's completely captivated by Valentine." Poirot, still staring at the sea, finally spoke. "Human nature, mademoiselle, is rarely surprising. People behave as they are predictably, consistently." Pamela frowned. "Oh, but I think people can be wonderfully unpredictable. Just when you think you've figured them out, they do something completely unexpected." "Non, mademoiselle," Poirot said with a gentle shake of his head. "The patterns of human behavior are as repetitive as the waves of the sea. They appear different, but they are the same." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Valentine Chantry. Draped in a scarlet and gold silk wrap that slid provocatively from her shoulders, she walked with an air of effortless elegance. The entire beach seemed to pause to watch her. Tony Chantry followed close behind, his dark, brooding presence a stark contrast to her radiance. As she settled on the sand, Valentine's gaze swept across the beach and landed on Douglas Gold. Her sapphire blue eyes lingered a moment too long. Pamela whispered, "She's toying with him already. Just look at her." Douglas, transfixed, barely responded to his wife's attempt at conversation. "Shall we swim now, Douglas?" Marjorie's voice was soft, tense. "In a minute," Douglas replied absently, his attention still fixed on Valentine. Marjorie's shoulders slumped as she walked to the water's edge alone. Pamela's lips tightened in disapproval. "Poor woman," she muttered. "She doesn't stand a chance against someone like Valentine." Poirot's gaze followed Marjorie. "It is often those who appear least remarkable who surprise us most," he said softly. Pamela, undeterred, continued to observe the unfolding drama. Tony Chantry's dark eyes never left his wife, even as she laughed and stretched languidly in the sun. There was a tension in his posture, a barely restrained fury simmering beneath the surface. "If she tries to leave him, I think he might be dangerous," Pamela said in a hushed voice. Poirot's expression grew thoughtful. "Danger often lies not in what is visible but in what is hidden," he murmured, tracing a triangle in the sand with his... "What's that?" Pamela asked curious. "A triangle," Poirot replied, his tone inscrutable. The Chantrys, the Golds, and the sparkling waters of Rhodes were more than just players in a casual holiday scene. Beneath the idyllic surface, Poirot sensed the subtle currents of deceit, desire, and danger. And as he watched the players move across the beach, he knew the true drama was yet to unfold. Valentine Chantry shifted slightly on the chaise lounge, her eyes lazily tracing the figure of Douglas Gold. Her scarlet lips curled into a faint, knowing smile, and his neck flushed a noticeable shade of Tony Dar, she cooed, her voice dripping with sweet entitlement. Would you mind fetching my little pot of face cream? It's up on the dressing table, I simply forgot to bring it. Do be an angel. Commander Chantry rose without a word, his expression stoic as he stalked off toward the hotel. Meanwhile, Marjorie Gold dived into the sea with a gleeful splash, her laughter trailing behind. She wasn't just fighting for her survival now. She was fighting for her soul. Because the house, the cult, the rituality wasn't just about trapping her in a nightmare. It was about consuming her. She wasn't meant to be a mere victim, a casualty of the house's dark history. She was the next piece, the next soul to be claimed by the cycle. The dials were not just a puzzle to be solved, they were a trap, and she had walked right into it. The cult's true goal was more insidious than anything she had ever imagined. They didn't just want to trap her in the house. They wanted to keep her trapped in time, forever. To twist her memories, to erase her past, and to make her a part of the endless loop. They wanted to rob her of everything that made her human, to reduce her to a shadow, a whisper in the dark. A pawn in a game that stretched beyond time, beyond comprehension. And now, as she faces the cold, silent truth of their existence, she understands the stakes. She is no longer just running from a murderer, no longer simply a victim of a haunted house. She is up against an ancient force that controls time itself, a cult that feeds on fear and thrives in silence, and a house that is both a prison and a living, breathing entity. The dials aren't just turning, they're closing in, one click at a time, until she is nothing but a whisper in the wind, another victim of the endless cycle. There is no escape. Not anymore. The silence is deafening, and the only thing left to do is fight for her mind, for her soul, for her very existence. But in a place where time is no longer real, where the past and future are blurred, and where the very walls seem to close in on her at every turn, can she even hope to win? The endless cycle of time. The house is still, but the air vibrates with the weight of inevitability. Time has stretched into an endless loop, a never-ending spiral that twists and bends around the very core of her being. The final chimes of the clock reverberate through the mansion like a death knell, and in the silence that follows, she feels the walls pressing in. She is no longer sure if she is standing in a room or if the room itself is standing around her, a part of the clock's twisted mechanism. The dials, now frozen at their cruel, predetermined moments, feel like eyes watching her every move. Each tick, each talk, is a reminder that time is not on her side. It never was. Time, she realizes with a growing horror, has always been the prison. It is shaping them. It has shaped her, carved her path with precision, until she is nothing but a cog in its machine. Pamela leaned toward Sarah Blake and muttered, "If Valentine Chantry rolls her eyes and says, 'Darling,' one more time, I might scream," Sarah smirked. "Oh, let her have her fun. She'll burn out soon enough. But look at him," she added, tilting her head toward Commander Chantry. Sure enough, Commander Chantry's eyes were locked on Douglas and Valentine, his face stormy. Poirot's sharp gaze caught the tension, and without a word, he bent down and traced a familiar shape in the sand, a triangle. Sarah noticed the gesture. Poirot's lips curved into a faint smile. "No." "Madame, when one observes such dynamics, it is inevitable." Sarah's eyes sparkled with anticipation. Then we're in for an interesting few weeks. Poirot, however, was less enthused. He had come to Rhodes for peace, yet the storm brewing among the guests suggested his respite would be short-lived. The brightness of her enthusiasm was just a shade too much. As Marjorie Gold greeted Hercule Poirot that morning, her exuberance rang hollow to his keen ears.
"Good morning,"
she said with such fervor that it aroused his doubts. He couldn't help but think she couldn't possibly be as delighted to see him as she appeared to be. After all, they hardly knew each other. While Hercule Poirot was not immune to a touch of professional conceit, he held a modest view of his personal charms. "Good morning, madam," Poirot responded politely. "Another beautiful day." "Yes, isn't it? We're so lucky with the weather." Marjorie's voice bubbled with forced cheer. "Douglas and I are always lucky that way." "Truly indeed," Poirot said, observing her close. "Yes," she went on, a little too quickly. "We're really very lucky, Douglas and I. 5 years is quite a long time, don't you think? Especially nowadays, with so many couples divorcing and all that sort of." Poirot's eyes twinkled with restrained amusement. "In some cases, madam, 5 years can seem like an eternity." She laughed, the sound brittle. "Oh, but we're so perfectly suited to each other. That's the secret, you know. Being I feel so sorry for people who aren't happy in their marriage." Poirot inclined his head. "It is pleasant to hear you say so, ma'am." Her voice lowered, almost conspiratorial. "Like Mrs. Chantry, for instance. I don't think she's a very nice woman, do you?" Poirot's tone remained neutral. "Perhaps not." Marjorie hesitated, threading a needle with trembling fingers. She's the sort of woman men get tired of quickly. Don't you think so, Mr. Poirot?" Poirot's reply was cautious. "I myself would tire of her conversation rather swiftly." Marjorie's lips quivered as she smiled. "Yes, that's what I mean. She has an appeal, of course, but it's fleeting. Men are like children sometimes. They believe anything. It's so unfair." Poirot noted the distress etched across her face. Her words, meant to seem offhand, betrayed deeper emotions. He decided it was time to shift the conversation. "You do not bathe this morning, madam? And your husband? Is he on the beach?" Marjorie blinked, her brightness returning almost defiantly. "Oh no, not this morning. We were supposed to go into the town together, but we missed each other. He must have gone ahead." The subtle crack in her voice didn't escape Poirot. Before he could reply, General Barnes appeared, striding up from the beach below. "Good morning, Mrs. Gold." "Morning, Poirot. What's this? Both of you deserters today?" the general asked jovially. "A lot of absentees this morning," he continued. "You two, Mrs. Chantry, and her husband. Though I saw the commander down there with Miss Pamela. She's got him in hand, though he's one of those strong, silent types. Can't be easy." Marjorie shivered visibly. "Commander Chantry frightens me a little. He has a look about him, like he might do anything." The general chuckled. "Probably just indigestion. Half the time, that's what gives people their reputations for being gloomy or hot-tempered." Marjorie offered a polite smile but said nothing. Here is your good man," the general pressed. "Douglas? Oh, he and Mrs. Chantry have gone to the town to look at the old city walls," Marjorie said, her tone steady but her eyes betraying something else entirely. The general nodded. "Ah, interesting stuff, those old knights and whatnot. You should have gone too, Mrs. Gold." "I came down late this morning," she replied quickly, standing abruptly. With a murmured excuse, she disappeared into the hotel. The general watched her retreat with a concerned shake of his head. "Nice little woman, that," he said, almost to himself. "Worth a dozen painted trollops like some we won't mention. Her husband's a fool. Doesn't know when he's well off." Sarah Blake, coming up from the beach, caught the general's last remark. She rolled her eyes as he departed, then flung herself into a chair. "Nice little woman. Nice little woman. Men always say that about the dull ones, but when it comes down to it, it's the painted trollops who win every time. Sad, but true." Poirot's voice cut in abruptly. "Mademoiselle, I do not like all this." Sarah's expression shifted to one of interest. Don't you? Well, I suppose I do. Let's be honest. T here is a part of us that enjoys the drama. The accidents, the scandals, the calamities. Poirot's expression remained serious. There is something here I do not understand. Sarah smirked. What's to understand? Mrs. Gold is unhappy, Mrs. Chantry is trouble, and Mr. Gold is oblivious. As for Commander Chantry, Pamela's trying to charm him, but it's like poking a thundercloud. If you are looking for squalls, Monsieur Poirot, you've come to the right place. Poirot's gaze drifted toward the horizon. Yes, he murmured. There are storms ahead, and they will not leave us untouched. It's not easy to understand, said Sarah with a thoughtful air. But the real question is what's going to happen next. Poirot, seated with his usual composed demeanor, tilted his head slightly. His eyes, however, betrayed a keen sense of curiosity. As you say, mademoiselle, it is the future that causes one inquietude. Sarah gave a wry smile. What a nice way of putting it, she said before heading into the hotel. In the doorway, she nearly collided with Douglas Gold. He appeared rather pleased with himself, but carried a faint trace of guilt, like a child caught sneaking a second helping of dessert. Hello, Mr. Poirot, he greeted nervously. Been showing Mrs. Chantry the Crusaders' walls. Marjorie didn't feel up to going. Poirot's eyebrows rose just a fraction, a subtle signal of his interest. But before he could make a comment, the unmistakable voice of Valentine Chantry interrupted. She swept onto the scene like a whirlwind, her commanding presence drawing all eyes. Douglas, a pink gin positively. I must have a pink gin. Her voice was high-pitched and demanding, but there was an undeniable allure to her charm. Douglas hesitated before hurrying off to fulfill her order. Valentine, with her golden hair gleaming in the sunlight, sank into the chair beside Poirot, radiating a confidence that was impossible to ignore. Just then, her husband, Commander Chantry, appeared at the top of the steps, his expression dark and brooding. He strode past her without a glance, his jaw clenched, and his fists tight by his sides. The resemblance to a gorilla, so often remarked upon in jest, seemed alarmingly real at that moment. Valentine's mouth, usually set in a practiced pout, fell open. Ow, she said blankly, as if the moment had knocked her usual poise askew. Pamela Lai, who had appeared behind the commander, settled into a chair with an almost predatory satisfaction. Have you had a nice morning? She asked, her tone sweet but with an unmistakable edge. Valentine, rallying quickly, replied, Simply marvelous, oui. But Poirot, with his uncanny sense for tension, chose that moment to rise and saunter toward the bar. Inside, he found Douglas Gold waiting for the pink gin, his face flushed with agitation. The young man's temper was barely contained. That man's a brute, Douglas muttered, nodding toward the doorway through which Commander Chantry had disappeared. Poirot considered this with a measured gaze. It is possible, he replied with a hint of detachment. Yes, quite possible. But, mon ami, let us not forget les femmes. They often like brutes. Douglas looked taken aback. I wouldn't be surprised if he mistreats her, he said, lowering his voice as if afraid someone might overhear. He's got that look about him. Poirot gave a small, enigmatic smile. And yet, monsieur, she might like that too. The young man stared at him, puzzled, before grabbing the pink gin and leaving in a hurry. Poirot, unbothered, ordered himself a sirop de cassis and sat on a stool, sipping the drink with the air of a man entirely at peace with the world. The calm was soon interrupted by the thunderous entrance of Commander Chantry. He downed several pink gins in quick succession, his movements sharp and aggressive. His anger, clearly, was not the kind that simmered quietly. It erupted like a volcano. If Valentine thinks she can get rid of me like she's done with the rest of those damn fools, she's mistaken, he snarled, speaking more to the bottles behind the bar than to Poirot. I've got her, and I mean to keep her. No one else is going to have hair except over my dead body. He slammed a handful of coins on the bar and stormed out, his footsteps heavy with rage. Poirot watched him go, his mind a web of intricate calculations. The scene played out like the setup of a stage drama, each character taking their position, their roles intertwined in a narrative that only he seemed to understand fully. 3 days later, the inevitable happened. The Mount of the Prophet loomed ahead, a peaceful and serene place, where the world's noise seemed to fade into nothingness. The drive had been smooth, the air crisp and fresh as they climbed higher, moving beyond the petty squabbles and frustrations of human existence. At the top, far above, there was only the vastness of the world below, with a serene beauty that calmed the soul. The car came to a stop at a quaint restaurant perched on the mountain's edge. Poirot, feeling the weight of the world lift off his shoulders, stepped out and wandered into the surrounding woods. His steps took him deeper until he found a spot so remote, so untouched, that it seemed as if it was truly the top of the world. The sea stretched far below, a dazzling, endless blue, as if the sky and ocean had merged into one vast canvas. For the first time in what seemed like ages, here, in this secluded spot, there was no pressure, no worries, just the soothing whisper of the wind through the golden-green fir tree. Carefully, he laid his overcoat on a tree stump, sinking onto the cool earth beneath him. It was a moment of reflection, an opportunity to step away from the chaos of the world. Doubtless Leon knows what he is doing, Poirot mused aloud. But it is strange that he should have fashioned certain people to be in my life. His thoughts drifted as the quiet of the mount wrapped around him, and for a moment, it seemed as if time itself had. But then, as if on cue, the illusion of peace was shattered. She approached quickly, her steps hurried, as if she were running from something, or perhaps to something. Her face was pale, streaked with tears. The once certain woman, always so poised and elegant, now seemed lost, vulnerable. She rushed toward him, desperation in her eyes. She gasped, clutching his coat sleeve. "You have to help me. I am so miserable. I don't know what to do."
No. What should I do?
Poirot's eyes narrowed, and he instinctively took a step back, his mind already calculating the reasons for her distress. There was always more to her than met the eye, and he knew that this was no casual visit. "What is it?" he asked sharply. She faltered, glancing up at him with a mixture of fear and hope. "What should I do?" she repeated, her voice trembling. Poirot, his gaze steady, exhaled a long breath. "Leave this place. Leave the island, now, before it is too late." She stared at him, confusion clouding her face. "What? Leave? Why?" Her voice quivered with disbelief. "I mean it," Poirot continued, his voice low and unwavering. "Leave the island, before it's too late." Marjorie's eyes widened. She couldn't comprehend what he was saying. "But why? I don't understand." "Listen to me, Marjorie. If you value your life, leave. This island is no place for you anymore." Poirot's words were like cold, hard stone. She took a step back, fear creeping into her features. Her hands trembled as she clutched the fabric of his coat tighter. What do you mean? You are frightening me." "Poirot, please," she stammered. "What should I do?" Poirot sighed, the weight of the situation settling heavily on him. "It's simple. You have to leave this place, these people." He hesitated for a moment, his gaze distant as if seeing something far beyond her. "You have to escape." Marjorie's face contorted in distress, her mind racing, trying to grasp the full meaning of his words. "I can't," she whispered, shaking her head. "I can't." "Douglas!" Her voice broke, and she looked away, tears welling in her eyes once again. "He won't come with me. He's caught in her grip, Poirot. The woman she's controlled. I don't know what to do. He doesn't listen to me anymore. All he sees is her and her lies. She has him convinced that she's the victim, that her husband hurt. She manipulates him, tells him things that aren't." Poirot stood there, his jaw clenched. He had known, of course, that there was more to this tangled mess than met the eye. But hearing it out loud, the desperation in her voice sent a chill through. Douglas believes everything she says, Marjorie continued, voice breaking. He wants to divorce me. He's convinced she'll leave her husband and marry him. But I know, Chantry, you won't let her go. I don't know what will happen. He's so full of honor, so chivalrous. But I am afraid. I am afraid for him, for all of Puo. His gaze unwavering, turned towards the distant hills, his mind working furiously to piece everything together. I understand your fear, he said slowly. But here is only one thing you can do. Leave this place, and do it now, before everything falls apart. Marjorie shook her head, her expression full of hopelessness. I can't. I can't leave without him. He needs me. But he doesn't even see it. Not any. Puo looked at her, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on his shoulders. He knew that time was running out. He could see the storm brewing, the danger that was close, but there was nothing more he could do for her. At least, nothing that she was willing to accept. Meanwhile, Pamela Lyle sat with Puo on the beach, watching the shifting tides. She spoke with a certain dark amusement in her voice. It seems the triangle is growing stronger by the, she remarked. I saw them last night, glaring at each other. Chantry had too much to drink, of course. It was embarrassing. Puo did not respond immediately, his eyes scanning the horizon. He knew that the situation was deteriorating fast, and no one, not even he, could predict what would happen. Miss Lyle leaned forward, her curiosity piqued. What will happen next, Puo? What are you going to do? He sighed heavily. I've done what I can, Miss Lyle. I've warned her. That's all I can. Miss Lyle's eyes gleamed with intrigue. But what have you really done? You've advised her to leave, but she won't listen. What's next? Puo turned to face her, his eyes filled with an unsettling calm. I've done what I could. The rest is up to her. But here is a word, Miss Lyle. A word that we must not, and that word is. Pamela froze, her breath catching in her throat. Murder? She whispered, as if the word itself held. Puo's voice was grim. Yes, mademoiselle, murder. It's in someone's mind. And when it's in someone's mind, here is no stopping it. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. The shadows of danger loomed large on the horizon, and it seemed that no one was prepared for the storm that was about to break. A chill ran through the room as Pamela's voice broke the silence. I don't believe it, she declared, her eyes wide with disbelief. But the events that unfolded on the night of the 29th of October seemed anything but a mystery. The tension between the two men, Douglas Gold and Commander Chantry, had been building for days. Their animosity had escalated to a scene that no one in the hotel would forget. Chantry's voice had risen to a fever pitch, an unmistakable rage that echoed through the corridors. The last words he had spoken were overheard by 4 witnesses: the cashier, the manager, General Barnes, and Pamela herself. The words were seared into their memories, sharp as daggers. You goddamn swine, Chantry had shouted, his face flushed with anger. If you and my wife think you can put this over on me, you are mistaken. As long as I am alive, Valentine will remain my wife. The fury in his words was palpable, and with one final enraged flourish, he had stormed out of the hotel. His exit had been swift, leaving behind a trail of tension and confusion. That, they knew, had happened before dinner. But after dinner? Well, that was when the truth started to become more elusive. No one really knew what had happened between the two men after the confrontation. What was certain, though, was that a reconciliation had taken place. Valentine Chantry had invited Marjorie Gold to join her for a moonlit drive, with Pamela and Sarah accompanying them. The group had returned to the hotel, where the men Gold and Chantry had played billiards together. For the first time in what felt like forever, Chantry was in a good mood, his smile genuine, his demeanor relaxed. It seemed, for a brief moment, that the tension between the two had evaporated, leaving only the illusion of camaraderie. As they joined Puo and General Barnes in the lounge, the atmosphere was oddly light. Chantry, usually a reserved and taciturn man, was doing his best to engage in conversation, his voice betraying none of the anger he had shown her. The exchange was polite, if not entirely friendly, as they all discussed trivial matters. General Barnes was in the middle of an anecdote from his military career in India when the waiter arrived with the Gold returned from ordering the beverages, carrying the drinks with the air of someone who was trying to avoid eye contact, unsure of how to proceed after such a strange evening. The conversation continued on, though it felt like the energy in the room had shifted. They were all present, engaged in the polite rituals of social interaction. Yet something unspoken hung between. The women entered the room, and for a moment, it seemed that the night might return to. They were all laughing, talking, and in the best of spirits, despite the strange atmosphere that clung to the evening like a heavy fog. Valentine sat down beside her husband, her voice light and carefree as she spoke. "Tony, darling, it was too divine," she exclaimed, dropping into her chair with a flourish.
"You simply must come next time, Mrs. G.S."
Was absolutely delightful. You would have adored her. There was a brief pause as Chantry, his mood shifting like the weather, stood up to fetch another drink.
Yeah.
She smiled and replied sweetly, "Can I have an orangeade, please?" Chantry nodded, then turned to the others to check what they would. The atmosphere felt almost normal again, as if the tensions of the earlier confrontation had been buried beneath the ritual of drinks and pleasantry. Valentine, her smile dazzling, picked up her pink gin and took a sip.
No. I need it.
It was then that things took a turn for the worse. Gold, walking back from helping his wife with her coat, stopped abruptly. He had been listening to the laughter and small talk in the background, but something about the way Valentine was sitting caught his attention. She wasn't laughing anymore. Her posture was odd, her face pale, and her lips had begun to take on a strange blue hue. Her hand pressed tightly to her chest, and she gasped for air. "Val," Chantry called out, his voice concerned as he rushed back to her side. "What's the matter? What's going on?" I don't feel well," Valentine whispered, struggling to catch her breath. "I feel so strange." Her voice was faint, barely audible as she slumped in her chair. Puo stood frozen, his eyes narrowed as he surveyed the scene. The room seemed to grow quieter, the world outside fading into the background, as the gravity of the situation dawned on him. The once lively atmosphere had been replaced with an unsettling tension, a thick air of impending disaster. "What's happening to her?" Douglas Gold's voice cracked, his eyes wide with alarm. His gaze moved from Valentine to her husband, Chantry, who was now frantically trying to help his wife. Chantry, his face a mask of confusion and rising panic, shook Valentine gently. "Valentine, what happened?" he demanded, his voice breaking as he searched for answers. But she couldn't respond. Her lips moved soundlessly, her breath shallow, and her eyes fluttered weakly as if she were losing consciousness. Then, suddenly, Chantry spun around, his eyes wide with fury. "That was my drink, Gold. What the hell did you put in it?" His voice was a low growl, thick with accusation. Gold recoiled, his face draining of color as he stared in disbelief. I didn't do anything," he protested, his voice barely a whisper. "I didn't put anything in it. I swear." But the truth of the situation was undeniable. The drink that Valentine had sipped from Chantry's own pink gin had clearly been tampered with. Whatever had been in it, it was now coursing through her veins, and Valentine Chantry's life was slipping away, inch by inch, before their eyes. "Get the doctor, quickly!" General Barnes shouted, his voice filled with urgency. He sprang into action, moving toward the phone, but it was too late. The damage had been done. Within moments, Valentine had fallen silent, her body slumped lifeless in the chair. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. The group, all caught in the grip of shock and disbelief, could barely process what had just happened. Murder? Or was it an accident? The answer seemed too elusive, hidden in the web of lies and betrayal that had surrounded them. What was certain, however, was that no one would leave that room the same. The following morning, the hotel had descended into an oppressive silence. Pamela Lyle stood in the hallway, her face pale as death. Clad in a simple dark dress, she gripped the arm of Hercule Poirot, her knuckles white with tension, her eyes wide with shock, fixed on him as if searching for answers, though she already knew they were just out of reach. "It's horrible," she said in a low, trembling voice, her breath catching in her throat. "I knew it. I saw it coming." Poirot's expression remained grave, his face unreadable, yet his eyes betrayed the weight of the night's tragedy. He nodded solemnly, though his silence spoke volumes. Pamela's anxiety shifted into something more frantic, a growing sense of helplessness. She looked up at him, eyes filled with desperation. "You foresaw it, didn't you?" she asked, her voice trembling, almost accusing. "Murder," he answered quietly, his voice so calm it sent a chill through the room. Pamela shook her head violently, stepping away from him and pacing in tight, agitated circles. "You should have stopped it. You should have warned someone, anyone. It could have been stopped." She stomped her foot against the wooden floor in frustration, her voice rising with each word. "How?" Poirot asked, his tone steady, but with an edge of finality. It stopped her cold, and for a moment, her mind raced to find the answer that eluded her. "Couldn't you have gone to someone, the police, told them what you suspected?" "What could have been coming?" she pressed, grasping for something solid in the chaos. Poirot exhaled deeply, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the question. "And say what? That someone has murder in their heart?" he responded, his words measured but sharp. "Before the event, what could I have warned them about? Sometimes, Pamela, a person is determined to kill, and nothing can stop them." For a moment, Pamela fell silent, the gravity of his words sinking in. Her eyes flicked to the floor, her thoughts muddled. "But surely here is something more we could have done." "Sometimes warnings are useless," Poirot added slowly, almost regretfully. "A criminal doesn't believe their crime can fail. That's their chief vice, their conceit." Pamela's voice broke through the quiet. "But it's absurd, Poirot. This crime, this whole thing, it's childish. The police arrested Douglas Gold almost immediately. They found the rest of the poison on him, didn't they?" Her words came in a rush, as though speaking them aloud would somehow make them make sense. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, they did. Found it in his dinner jacket pocket. Quite true. But it's a different matter entirely." Pamela's face twisted in confusion. "Douglas Gold is incredibly stupid. Surely that's the reason it happened. He must have meant to dispose of it. But when the wrong person drank the poison, he panicked." The thought sent a shiver down her spine, and she continued, speaking more to herself now than to Poirot. "Can you imagine it? The lover putting the poison in the wrong glass? That moment when Gold realized he had killed the woman he loved, instead of his rival?" Her voice caught, but she swallowed hard. "The eternal triangle. I was afraid of it, Poirot. I was afraid something like this would happen." Poirot's gaze was distant, as if he were turning over a puzzle in his mind. His voice was barely a whisper as he replied, "I warned her. I warned Mrs. Gold, but I didn't warn him." Pamela's eyes flashed. She snapped, turning on him. "Why didn't you warn him, Poirot? Commander Chantry, for God's sake, he was the real obstacle. Why didn't you warn him?" Poirot met her gaze, his eyes steady, almost pitying. "You think I could have warned Tony Chantry?" "No, Pamela, it wouldn't have mattered." He shrugged as if it were a small matter, though his words carried the weight of something deeper. "Chantry wouldn't have listened. He would have told me to go to hell." Pamela stood still for a long moment, absorbing his words, her mind racing. "So what do we do now, Poirot? What could have been done?" Poirot looked at her with a strange kind of resignation, his shoulders tense. "I did consider warning Valentine Chantry. I thought about telling her to leave the island, to get away from it all. But she was too stubborn, too proud. She wouldn't have believed what I had to say. She was too naive, too caught up in her own world. A stupid woman who couldn't see the danger. Pamela's voice faltered. "Are you saying her stupidity killed her?" "I am saying," Pio replied slowly, "that sometimes we don't see what's right in front of us, and we pay the price for it." The words hit Pamela hard, and for a moment, she seemed lost, her mind caught in the web of possibilities and regrets. "But if she had left the island, she would have been safe," she said weakly. "Gold wouldn't have followed her. He couldn't have." Pio shook his head firmly, his eyes narrowing. "No, Pamela, you are wrong. You are completely wrong. You don't understand the truth of this matter yet." Pamela blinked, her confusion deepening. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice small. "If Valentine Chantry had left the island," Pio said, his voice low, "her husband would have gone with her. Of course he would." Pamela stared at him, trying to piece it together. "But that means the crime would have happened elsewhere." "Exactly," Pio said, his tone resolute. "The crime would have happened elsewhere, and it would have been exactly the same." Pamela's eyes widened as realization dawned on her. "You are saying Tony Chantry murdered his wife?" Pio nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Yes. It was Tony Chantry. It was always Tony." Pamela took a step back, her mind reeling. "But I saw Gold give him his drink. I saw it, Pio. Chantry had his drink in front of him. He sat with it, and when the women came in, we all saw him drink from it. He passed it to her. He did that." "Exactly," Pio said with a hint of something almost like admiration in his voice. "Chantry had been planning to kill Valentine for some time. He was tired of her. He was tired of the marriage. He married her for her money, and now he wanted to marry someone else. That's what this was all about. He poisoned her to get rid of her and keep her money." Pamela shook her head, fighting to make sense of it all. "But the packet of strychnine? It was found in Gold's pocket." "Yes, Pamela," Pio said, his voice calm. "It was in Gold's pocket, but that's because it was planted there. It was a simple matter to slip it there while we were all distracted with Valentine's collapse. It was no accident that it ended up in Gold's possession." The pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place, but Pamela's mind was still tangled in confusion. "So, all of this? The triangle, the love, the jealousy, it was all an illusion?" Pio nodded, his gaze steady. "It was all an illusion. You were deceived by clever acting. You thought the conflict was between Gold and Chantry. You thought that Gold, in love with Valentine and desperate to have her, poisoned Chantry out of jealousy. But that's not what happened. It was Chantry all along. He was the one who wanted Valentine dead, and Gold was merely the pawn in his game." Pamela stood frozen, her heart heavy with the weight of his words. "And the other woman, who was she?" she asked softly. Pio's eyes darkened as he responded. "Another woman, yes. Chantry had plans for someone else, someone younger, more suitable. A woman who would give him the life he truly desired. Valentine was simply a means to an end." Pamela closed her eyes, a shudder running through her body. She had been so sure of the truth, but now everything she thought she knew was slipping away, replaced by a new, darker reality. The triangle she had imagined was nothing more than smoke and mirrors, an illusion crafted with precision, and it had led them all down a path that none of them had expected. Pamela's eyes widened in realization, her breath quickening as Pio's words struck her like a bolt of lightning. She had been so certain, so convinced, that the tragic love triangle was the key to everything. Yet now, it seemed she had been looking at it all from the wrong angle. The eternal triangle? No, it wasn't that at all. That was the mistake. Pio continued, his tone matter-of-fact, his gaze steady as he assessed Pamela's stunned expression. Neither of those two men cared for Valentine Chantry. Not in the slightest. Pamela blinked, her mind whirling. What he was saying didn't make sense. How could it not be about love? Gold's obsession with Valentine, Chantry's jealousy, the poison, the passionate, all pointed to a twisted love story. Yet Pio was shattering that belief, piece by piece. It was her vanity, P.O. went on, his voice quiet but resolute. And Marjorie Gold's very clever stage managing that made you think they cared. That was the trick. Marjorie Gold is a devil. A cold-blooded schemer. She knew exactly what she was doing. Pamela's heart raced, and she felt a strange chill run through her. P.O.'s words were dark, calculated, but they held a certain truth that she couldn't ignore. The world around her seemed to tilt, as if the ground beneath her feet was shifting into a new reality, one she hadn't seen before. Marjorie Gold? Pamela echoed, her voice faint. But she's so charming, so innocent. She couldn't have. I've known women like her, P.O. interjected, his tone cutting through her disbelief. 4 women criminals of the same type. Madame Adams, acquitted of murdering her husband, though everyone knew she did it. Mary Parker, who killed an aunt, a sweetheart, and 2 brothers before her own carelessness got her caught. Madame Roden, who was hanged for her crimes, and Madame Ray, who barely escaped the noose. Marjorie Gold fits the same mold perfectly. Pamela took a step back, her mind reeling as P.O.'s words unraveled the reality she had built. You are saying Marjorie Gold is a criminal? She whispered, the shock reverberating through her. Exactly, P.O. said, his voice calm and sure. A very clever, very dangerous woman. She planned this crime with precision. She played everyone like pawns in her game. Pamela's breath hitched in her throat as she processed the implications. But what about Douglas Gold? What about the poison? He must have been in on it. P.O. gave her a hard look, as though assessing the depths of her understanding. Tell me, Pamela, what evidence did you ever have that Douglas Gold was truly in love with Valentine Chantry? He asked, his voice cutting through her fog of confusion. Pamela paused, her mind racing for answers. Well, either was his confession to Mrs. Gold and Chantry's jealousy of. P.O. shook his head slowly. Those were just Marjorie's words. Her manipulation. It's easy to create a story, to weave a tale of jealousy, passion, and love, when the real truth is far more sinister. You see, Pamela, there was never any real rivalry. All of it was a charade, expertly staged by Mrs. Gold. Pamela's heart pounded as the pieces fell into place. Precisely, P.O. replied, his voice calm but filled with a knowing bitterness. Douglas Gold was nothing more than a pawn. Marjorie Gold manipulated him, made him believe he was the lover, the one fighting for Valentine's affection. She played him, made him think he had a chance, but all the while she was using him as a Pamela shook her head, her thoughts scrambled. But he was arrested, P.O. The police took him last night. P.O.'s lips curled into a small, grim smile. Yes, he was arrested. But I had a little chat with the police after. It's true that I didn't see Commander Chantry slip the poison into the glass. I, like everyone else, looked up when the ladies entered. But the moment I realized that Valentine Chantry had been poisoned, I focused entirely on her husband. I watched, and there, in the crowd, I saw it. He slipped the packet of strychnine into Gold's coat pocket. Pamela's stomach twisted. You saw it? You saw him? I did, P.O. confirmed, his eyes hard. I am a good witness, Pamela. My name is well known, and when the police heard my account, they understood that it changed it painted a whole new picture. The arrest of Douglas Gold didn't make sense anymore. Pamela stood in stunned silence, trying to wrap her mind around it all. So then, they questioned Chantry? She asked. Yes. P.O. replied, his gaze distant. They questioned him. He tried to bluster his way out of it, and that's when they realized they had the wrong. Pamela blinked, her mind slowly catching up. P.O. nodded. Yes, he was set free. And Marjorie Gold? Her face turned cold as stone when she heard the news. Pamela's eyes widened as the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. But you warned her, didn't you? She asked, her voice trembling with the weight of the truth. I did, P.O. confirmed, his expression hardening. I warned her. I told her I suspected her, that I knew what she was planning. But she didn't listen. She believed she was too clever. She thought she could outsmart me, outsmart everyone. But why didn't she leave? Pamela asked, her voice cracking. Why didn't she just leave and avoid all of this? P.O.'s eyes grew cold. I told her to leave, if she valued her life. She believed she could control everything. But in the end, the game played her. Pamela's breath caught in her throat. The weight of it all crashed down on her, leaving her breathless. The woman she had once seen as charming, as innocent, was nothing but a master manipulator, a cold-hearted criminal who had played everyone for fool. And in the end, it was her own arrogance, her own belief that she could outsmart the world, that had led to her on Marjorie Gold, Pamela whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. She got away with it all. Not for long, P.O. said, his voice icy with finality. No one outsmarts justice forever.